Hi, you all. Welcome back to another episode of WorkYogi Diaries. This is your host, Santosh Shiva. I bring you conversations with people who are masters of their craft or are on a journey to be masters. Hopefully, through their journeys, we can learn a few things in terms of new tips and strategies that can help us take our game to the next level. If you're new to this channel, please consider subscribing to it so you get the latest updates. Like this video and do please leave your comments and let us know if you took something away. In the house today is a futurist by trade. She describes herself as someone who is passionate about the future. Her focus is to anticipate, strategize, activate, and infuse the future into today's organization through future studies, foresight, strategy development, and planning. Additionally, she applies this expertise to some of the current societal challenges. One of them is in the area of mental health and suicide prevention, through her involvement in the Texas Suicide Prevention Collaborative. We dwell into what got her attracted to becoming a futurist. How does one train to become one? The importance of future planning. Her choice of suicide prevention as a cause and what's next in her horizon. Let's welcome Lisa Sullivan. Right. Hey Lisa, welcome to WorkYogi Diaries.
Hey, good afternoon.
It's such a pleasure having you on the show. You have a fascinating background on what you do and also some of the important projects that you're working on, especially in the Texas Suicide Prevention Collaborative, which we'll jump into. And your profession as a futurist, which is so fascinating, I'm sure our viewers will want to learn a few things about that. So before we jump into the main act, I'll hand it back to you and request you to do a quick personal introduction, and then we'll jump in.
Great. So I'm Lisa Sullivan. I am president of Infuse Corporation, and I'm also executive director of the Texas Suicide Prevention Collaborative. We're anchored in Austin, Texas, and have been here for quite a while. So we've had the opportunity to watch Austin evolve over the last couple decades. And it's been a great place to raise our family. And we now have two adults that are working in their own personal journey. And we're looking forward to seeing where that takes them as well.
Nice. And you describe yourself as a futurist, so I think having a futurist as a mother is helpful for them, I guess.
That's a double-edged sword. Some days yes, some days no, I think is how they would answer that question.
Yeah. Perfect. Hey, thanks for that intro. So, maybe we should jump in. And the first question I guess we can probably dwell around is a bit about your background, in professional background. How did you end up being a futurist? What is a futurist? So maybe we start from there.
That is a really great question, because it was one of those situations where adversity sprung opportunity. And I was in high school. My parents had just divorced, and my dad and I were relocating to a complete other town. And when I got there, my high school had a course in studies of the future. And a new classmate recommended I take it. And the very first day of that class, we walked in. The instructor walked in right behind us, closed all the doors, pulled all the curtains, just, had this real secretive look. And he launches into this scenario about human experimentation for the pharmaceutical industry and the drug industry. And this was many years ago, right? So it was before a lot of the newer technologies have come to play into that. But he launched this whole scenario on how we had the opportunity to cure, I think it was cancer or whatever it was. And we had to make the decision right there in the next 15 minutes whether or not we were going to agree to be injected with the disease itself so they could try out the cure. And every class was a scenario that eventually I now have come to realize the vast majority of them I have covered in my adult life. So it was studying all those classics, Herman Kahn and folks like that were just such leading thinkers in that space. And I just always go back to that because that was one of those sea change structural shifts in the way I thought about the world. And I wanted to help others do that as well. And so I progressed down further in my academics, went to business school, was looking for a graduate program, and I reached out to that teacher from my high school days, and he suggested the Studies of the Future program at the University of Houston at Clear Lake, and that's how I ended up in Texas. And that kind of launched the journey of the next bazillion years of my lifetime. So it is something that was kind of really pivotal in my formation and really pivotal in my worldview in terms of coming to grasp with the way the future evolves. And I'm very passionate about it. I identify myself as a futurist, and proudly so, and have gone on to do a number of projects and programs, everything from food packaging to the space station, to telecommunications, to organizational development. Everything has woven that skill set into the way I help organizations problem solve.
Wonderful. So let's zoom in that a little bit more. Just kind of rewinding back to that first introduction you had about the future, right?
Right.
And so, what exactly changed? I mean, what was the shift in your mindset that you're referring to?
Well, I think there's a couple things. It's the time span of discretion, right? So when we're looking about, when we perceive the future, we have a time span where we can imagine or contemplate alternatives or outcomes, if you will. And depending on where you are in terms of your ability in that area, determines how far your time horizon is. And if you can't either extend the time horizon or if you can't perceive other options, your pathway gets very narrow. And so futures really provided that opportunity to expand that time horizon and also that breadth of the possible for me. And that for me was very pivotal in my formation.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so talking about this choice of the the bachelor's program that you did itself, right? What do you learn in this program? What does it prepare you for?
So it's actually at the master's level. And so when we took the training, and again, it has evolved since we've been there, but it is considered one of the premier programs in the world on studies of the future and methodologies. So you learn all of those tool sets that help those you are working with apply that thinking to the problem domain or the environment that they're working in. We had robust scenario planning. We had robust other tools like how to run a Delphi method, that sort of thing. And some of it was more seminar kind of level. So looking at things like world futures. How is the world perceived differently across cultures? How is the future perceived differently across cultures? And then there was an application piece to that. So we're learning these tools and we're learning these techniques and we're understanding worldviews and we're understanding personal views about the future. Now let's problem solve. What can we work on? And the beauty about that particular time in the program was it sat adjacent to NASA Johnson Space Center. So you were exposed to all of these long-range projects and things that were in play for 20 or 30 years from a visionary perspective, and how those day-to-day decisions are being made to move towards that accomplishment. So those were kind of the main three areas, was kind of the tool set development, the kind of the world view development, and then your personal view development is part of that process.
Wow. That's so fascinating. I feel like all of us need to do a crash course on this subject.
I have been an advocate for years that there is no reason why you should have to be a master student to have this. This should be really being taught in our K-12 environments. It's that critical thinking piece that really helps us all kind of visualize a range of outcomes, not just the precise future. And if there was one message that sort of came out of that program is there's no precise the future. It's a range of possibilities, and it's the decisions that are made along the way that influence where we get to. So that's what we really try to help folks do when we're doing planning with them.
And in terms of core competence in something like this, is it more is it more left brain, science oriented, math oriented, or is it more liberal arts, more blue ocean thinking, imagination? Because today our courses tend to bracket us in one of the two, right? And is this is different? Is this more? So can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So one of the things, this was a very tiny program. I think at the peak I was there, it maybe had 30 students, but it had the highest concentration of international students per capita, of any program at the time in the UH system. And then the other beauty about it was there was no precise discipline that people came from. They weren't all science majors or liberal arts majors. It was really, we had everyone from nursing to astronaut training to systems engineers to teachers. So it was really about the thinking, not necessarily how it would eventually be applied in your world. So for me, that was the richest part of that, was pulling all those disciplines together in the conversation. And it really wove a tremendous and vibrant tapestry of how to problem solve across so many dimensions. And I just really value that still to this day, that experience.
Yeah, that's pretty much how the real world works, I think, right? In the sense that most of us end up having the stream of education, and then we spend all our lives just repeating what we've learned, in a professional environment. But the real world constantly throws at you problems and opportunities which are not necessarily solvable from a narrow window that you're trained in. It's, and you spend rest of your life trying to figure out why that doesn't work. And you're trying to, learn new techniques and new methods. And so what you describe seems to be a reflection of what all of us need to deal with the real world. So before we jump into the suicide collaborative topic, I want to also understand a little bit about your business. So what do you do? What does a futurist do? We got a glimpse about it from a perspective of your training and what problems you're trying to solve. But today, what exactly would this profession do for a business or for the enterprise?
So the types of problems that come our way, or the types of challenges that come our way, are those that typically don't lend themselves well to traditional planning techniques. So, they're wicked problems, however you want to define them, but they usually have a multidimensionality to it, and either a high degree of uncertainty or a high degree of complexity to it. So an example would be back in the 80s, telecom companies were contemplating these wireless devices, and everybody was walking around with walkie-talkies on construction sites, and they go like, we think that there might be something like this one day, and we're going to call them personal communications systems. But how would people use them? Why would people use them? Why should we be investing in that area? And so, you write scenarios, and you say, and you look at that from multiple different points of view, not just low, medium, high, but how structural change could happen that could influence that. And then what are some of the byproducts of that? So it's that kind of problem. Another one is if you're working inside a group that's fairly high or highly diversified. where are those points of leverage across those things 5 or 10 years down the road from now that has a multidimensionality and a multiplier effect if you can strategize properly for that. So those are the kinds of things that we tend to get into. And again, it's been everything from food packaging to literally systems engineering strategies for different kinds of large-scale systems. Pharma is a big one because of the time horizon involved. Education is a long one because of the time horizon involved. And workforce, because again, the time horizon involved. How do you prepare tomorrow's workforce for tomorrow's situations in today's educational infrastructure? So those are the kinds of things, both on the private sector and then on the more social impact side.
And how do you envisage that, in the sense that do you envisage it, or do your customers have to figure this out? So, for example, if you look at digital transformation, and the way that's impacted the world today, the way there's been this disintermediation of layers in almost all businesses, which is eliminating jobs and business processes like never before. Most businesses, especially in the traditional businesses, are not prepared for it. They're caught unawares. They're shutting down or struggling to reinvent. And something like this came like sporadically. It's like almost as if it was happening in the background and just suddenly spurted out. And so let's say we are sitting in 2021 and we're looking at 2050. For example, we're talking about things like even artificial intelligence being fused with human intelligence using things like nanotechnology.
Right.
These are things you read about today. And so 30 years down the line, someone who can afford nano computing in their brain becomes the more privileged person of society versus, let's say, somebody who does not have access to that. I'm just making this up. But so how does one actually, do you collaborate with universities? Where do these kind of scenarios actually end up, you get a source from?
So, that's a really good question because, scenarios are only as good as the inherent assumptions that the developer of those scenarios are bringing into the equation, as well as the information sources that you're putting into this, right?
Yeah.
So it really takes an all hands on deck approach. The way we manage it here is we manage a network of people who are experts in industries that we feel are kind of those multiplier type industries that we just track and watch and visit with and pick their brain and here's where we're anchoring now. Where do you think this is going, and have kind of those regular conversations with folks to be sure that that internal biases aren't necessarily clouding some of the possibilities or plausibilities that are out there. So that's one of the key ways is, in the last 10 years, the information explosion and the accessibility of information has been great, but that doesn't mean we're using it wisely. So, not having that core analytics or assessment capabilities really does play into the conversation in my mind. Yep.
It's fascinating, but thanks for sharing. But whatever you're doing is very important, that's for sure. Because I'm personally from the tech industry, and I can see up close the kind of possibilities the technology industry is just simulating, and that's what the technology industry is going to be selling to business. Hey, the art of the possible. This is what you can do, and some digest it, some don't. So it's fascinating.
That's exactly
So,
right. And
yeah.
for me, a big leverage point is always displacement, right? What will
Mm,
displace our industry? What will displace our technology? What will
yeah.
displace our marketplace? Those
Yeah.
questions are things people, nobody likes to talk about that, because
Yeah.
nobody wants to see the demise of their work. But if you use it for a leverage of evolution and evolve
Yeah.
and involve your organization strategically, that works to your advantage. So having those conversations, those critical conversations, is very important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Beautiful. So, kind of moving forward, and pivoting into the other project that you're really involved in, which is the Texas Suicide Prevention Initiative. Um, this is a big deal for a lot of us who have kids and who have kids who are growing up in today's world. Huge increase in mental health, issues among young people, and amongst not only young people, I think in population in general.
Right.
So what you're doing is very important. So please, love to hear about what this is. How does it work? So yeah, please give us a sense of a bit of that.
Sure, sure. So my interest in this space really came around after I became a parent, and the kind of first phase of my career really focused on helping industries kind of make their most preferable futures. But once that parenting DNA
Hmm.
hits, it really became about kind of those social impact spaces,
Hmm.
education, workforce, nonprofit sectors, government agencies. And through that work, I started doing some long range planning for some mental health groups. And
Hmm.
that kind of led into suicide prevention as a component of the overarching mental health space. Suicide prevention is kind of that last gatekeeper that when your mental health systems are failing, that is the one thing that then keeps people alive. So
Hmm.
we
Yes.
want to be sure that not only are we addressing the mental health system and its architecture and its capacity um, to help prevent people getting into crisis, but then for those that we
Hmm.
aren't able to reach for whatever reason, that we have those necessary checks and balances in place to help keep that person safe while they process through
Hmm.
their crisis
Yeah.
situation. So a while back, when I was working with a mental health group, um, I was approached about working in this specific area on a couple of key pieces, and I was interested in that. I just thought that that is a nice, from a social good point of view, it's the right thing to do. But then also with the perspective that I brought, I really felt like maybe I could add value in some way
Hmm.
to this space. Um, so that began a journey that I've learned just so much about. Learned at the national and state level, suicide prevention is one of the most underfunded areas of research. If you compare suicide prevention to the West Nile virus, for instance, the figure that I heard shared with our group a couple years ago was suicide prevention gets 1/10 of the funding of West Nile virus, yet 138
Hmm.
people a year die by West Nile virus, where close to 50,000 people a
Yeah.
year in the US die by suicide. So once you start factoring that in, and then you factor in the fact that Texas typically ranks in the bottom 5 of mental health spending per capita, you can see where you've got a challenge in front of you
Yeah.
in terms of the way that we approach it, the way we approach p- people in crisis.
Hmm.
And so that kind of embarked on that journey of not only helping tactically with implementing some of those federal programs, but then also strategically of how are we ever going to get out of this situation where it's all reactive. And that was
Hmm.
one of the things that I learned in planning for nonprofits generally, was to break that mindset of going grant to grant or funder to
Hmm.
funder. Really, in my personal opinion, if your nonprofit is successful, our goal should be to eliminate the need for whatever it is we're working on. So if we're working in homelessness, whatever we're working on should not only help people affected by homelessness, but we should also eliminate why people are homeless in the first place.
Right.
And so I started looking at it through that lens for suicide prevention. And when you look at the geography of Texas, we have 160 million acres. 130 million of those acres are classified as rural. We've got a geography problem. How can we leverage? How can we amplify? How can we collectively work towards system solutions when you have that big of geography? You can't plan like Rhode Island may be able to with 4 or 8 people in a room, and you can get to every corner of the state in a handful of hours. We're talking a day's drive, or in some cases 2 days drives across our state. And so it really started making me, or allowing me, the opportunity to put that futurist lens to the dynamic at play. And then in 2016, a tremendous pivot happened. And that is when the vast majority of funding that comes into Texas comes in through federal grants. And in 2016, the federal grant ran out and it was not being renewed. And that created a huge challenge, because now we have some of these things built and ready to go and flying, but we have no way to sustain it. In my mind, it's like, okay, you've built the space station, you've launched it, but now we're not going to fund it anymore. And yet we've got to keep this thing in orbit, and we've got to keep it running, and we've got to keep it viable. And that's when I kind of stepped into this in a more intensive way to try to see if we couldn't find that pathway forward of how do we, never get in this situation again where we're relying on federal funds, and B, communicate that people who die by suicide die in our communities. They're not dying in our public health systems. They're dying in our communities. So to make that impact, that community capacity, boots on the ground, is really where we can influence change. Connecting those people that may be at risk to that public health system is one dimension. But if you have no one intercepting someone at risk, how are they ever going to bridge over to there? And the analogy that's often used is CPR. So the city that you are most likely to survive a heart attack in is not Houston, not Miami, not New York, but it's Seattle. And the reason why is because Seattle has the most people trained in CPR per capita. So you have people that understand warning signs and risk factors and know what to do and know how to connect to care. Nobody's asking them to do heart surgery in the middle of the street, but they are able to intervene with somebody in crisis and connect them to care. And that's where our communities, we don't have that capacity because that capacity has never been invested. So we want to be sure, that's what the Texas Suicide Prevention Collaborative is working to do, is to build that community capacity. So right now there's a network of about 40 local coalitions across the state, ranging from 2 people in Loveland, Texas, to 100 people in Bell County, which is where Fort Hood is. And our job as the nonprofit is to serve as that pipeline of information, resources, training, opportunity, connection, networking, to be sure we're all in the same boat rowing in the same direction. Because if we don't do that in a state as vast as ours, we are never going to make that impact on a one-off here and a one-off there. Everybody's got to be in the same boat, leveraging off of each other's hard work, and then serve as a multiplier throughout our communities to reach community stakeholders that can help develop that local capacity. And the same is true at the statewide partner level. The same is true in our higher ed. The same is true as our service member, veteran, and family communities. So that's our job. I mean, and, on the short part of that conversation. And then we also provide technical assistance in helping state agencies and others who are wrestling with some of these big systems challenges to bring that subject matter expertise into the dialogue, into the conversation, and into the planning. So that's kind of long-winded, but but I think it's important to understand kind of that vertical integration from the local to the state to the national level. So everything is following best practices and the research in this space, because funding is so limited across the board.
Got it. Very clear, very clear. So, the analogy you gave about, the CPR in Seattle, that hit home. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because I think what you say, it's common sense. A lot of us who are listening to this, who are not necessarily in the weeds of policy making or, creating how these things work, can relate to that. Because, when someone is in trouble, and we all encounter that nowadays, it's common. Mental health is is almost another epidemic, and you do come across young people, or people of all ages, dealing with this kind of a crisis. And what's the best way to support them is to find somebody locally in your community who can do that. So the question is, how do you identify these people? Is it somebody volunteers to it, or volunteers to be trained in this, or how does that work?
That's a really good question. So just a couple things that I want to just sort of back up and say. At the end of the day, our work is creating hope, connecting to care, and building resiliency in communities. And that is probably the biggest piece of this with suicide prevention, is that creation of hope and creation that there's help, and the realization there is help, and mental health conditions are treatable. If we can do nothing but communicate that, we will be very, very successful in reaching people who may need support. Yeah. But in terms of if you look at this from where community members can intervene, it's really all of us. I mean, it's not just school counselors or first responders. I mean, it's people you bump into at the grocery store. It's your neighbor talking over the fence about the kids. It's going to a Little League baseball game. It's playing softball or your faith-based community. You bump into people who are struggling every day in every part of our communities. And it's as simple as starting with, how are you? How are you doing? I mean, look what we've been through collectively with COVID. How are you doing? This is hard. How are you doing? And, giving people that space and opportunity to say, not so great, and then talking about that, making that connection to the individual is just so critically important, because that is the first step in connecting to care. You've got to connect with that person first. Texas has a phenomenal crisis network. It's for both our general population as well as our service member veterans and families, but we've got to connect to each other first, and then know where to connect that person to care.
Right. And you makes sense. So what I'm hearing is, first, being aware of where these resources are. First is to be concerned, to be aware that mental health is a treatable condition. It's not end of the road. And then, as a neighbor, as a friend, as a community member, just being concerned and being concerned about your neighbor and asking, right? So just from a sense of being connected. And the fourth is, if there is something that you sense as off, or if someone is at risk or is down, you got to know where to call, or where to point this person, or whom to call, you personally call, to help this person. So
exactly.
So what I gather is the collaborative is, the charter is to evangelize or make this broadly available as information across communities and institutions, correct?
Right. And so we get about probably 500 to 600 volunteer requests a year from people just coming through to our website. And I always connect them first to their local coalition, because that to me is where the best opportunity for adding that, for feeling that sense of community is. If you're calling from Houston, help in Houston. If you're calling from San Angelo, help that San Angelo community. So the very first step in this is to go to our website at texassuicideprevention.org, and under the About Us section, it has all the local coalitions throughout the state. Email that person and say, hey, I'm willing to jump into the fight here, put me to work. And what we love about the coalitions are they're following best practices. They're not flying by the seat of their pants or thinking what they should do. They're following the research, which is also part of what's so important in this space. And then they're able to then grab those folks and integrate them into the community fabric of prevention. And that is just such a remarkable value add.
Awesome. I'll make sure that I share the link on the show notes, so anyone interested can reach out to that. So that's great information. The second question that pops up in my mind is, you talked about funding, state versus federal, and some of us don't really pay too much attention to how this happens. We get what we want to get, and we don't question it. So give us a sense of what does it mean? Why is it that some things are federally funded? Why is it that something like this is not getting the attention from the Texas state government?
Well, I really can't answer that. I'm not sure I understand the reason. I do know that the state is making an investment in ensuring the public health portions of the system are equipped by deploying zero suicide throughout the state, which is huge. We are the largest state to do that. I think also it's difficult to demonstrate qualitative impact, right? How many people didn't die because of the work you did, right? So we want to be sure that we measure our impact to the degree we can. So this spring, we partnered with the LBJ School at the University of Texas at Austin to help us devise an evaluation tool that could help us determine across our local coalitions the important work that they're doing, because 90% of that work is also unfunded. So we need to really understand the investment individuals and communities are making, and yet we don't really have a good measure until now to be able to quantify that impact. I also think the research in terms of local coalitions, I just don't think we're there yet. The first part of this was to get the public health system stabilized and sufficiently equipped. Now we can turn our attention, hopefully, to the community capacity, those nonprofit partners and those community resources that are working in this line every single day. I'm hopeful in the coming years that conversation is going to shift.
Got it. So right now, the majority of the effort that's coming from the collaborative is either volunteering or it's some limited, federal funding that you've been able to get, right? That's what I understand.
Well, so we do partner with our state partners in helping deploy trainings. The vast majority of that is going into the public health system. So what we're trying to strategize around is how do we build that capacity for centers of excellence of education, suicide prevention, and rural suicide prevention, and community-based suicide prevention, and then provide those trainings at the community level to help educate our community partners. So right now, we've trained in the last 2 years over 500 workshop leaders across the state. If your community wants a suicide prevention training, All you have to do is email, and we will find you a trainer close to your local location. So for us, we're probably the biggest network in the country in terms of state penetration of trainers across the state. And so, and we're able to collect that data, right? So we know where those trainings are being deployed. We know who the audience is of those trainers, and we know when those
Yep.
trainings are deployed. So hopefully over time, as our data gathering gets better, we'll be able to demonstrate areas that have those CPR type numbers, that
Yep.
suicide activity would be lower in those communities, right? So
Yep.
that's our goal in this. So, but that's going to
Absolutely.
take a couple years to gather that data.
All right. No, thanks for sharing that, Lisa. That's very useful. Hopefully, we can amplify more of this and get this out there. And I think this is a journey, and we are in the middle of it. And thanks for all the what you're doing in this space, and wish you all the best. And definitely very stoked to hear about the good work you guys are doing.
Well, we appreciate the opportunity to visit with you and look forward to following your series and learning from the other amazing people that you are interviewing. So thank you for your time today.
Yes, yes, but we are not done yet. We have a few more things to do before we wind up.
Oh, okay.
I'm, I'm not letting
Sorry,
you
I
go
thought you were
yet.
getting me to go.
Not yet. I want to spend a little time in terms of like what's next for you. What else are you working on? Where
Oh,
are you headed? Yeah.
so it's really fascinating from that point of view. Are you? That's one of the things. One of the things that I'm looking very forward to is uh, that's kind of come full circle for me. Is that as I've gotten deeper and deeper into suicide prevention, there's some core pieces of the puzzle that we know are important to the prevention piece. And some of that revolves around
Mhm.
economic supports, for instance, economic security, housing,
Okay.
food insecurity, things of that nature. And to me, that kind of brings me full circle to the economic development work that I've done previously of the healthier our communities are, hopefully that translates into the more successful we're going to be from a suicide prevention standpoint. So I'd see eventually kind of re-engaging that piece of my portfolio back and incorporating it into the mental health space. I just feel like we really need long range strategies for our community development that isn't one size fits all or everybody wants to be this community or that community. And what does that mean from a sustainability and stress standpoint? How do we create and envision communities of the future? And communities being very broad, our civic institutions, our schools, what have you. So I'd like to spend a little time looking at that as part of the suicide prevention piece. But this is kind of like one of those things. It's like once you're out in, it's kind of difficult to get out. I'm
Yeah.
very grateful for the opportunity to work in this space. And I see myself always having a foot in this. I don't know that it'll always be both feet, because
Mm.
that futurist DNA is definitely raising its hand in the background and wanting to do more of that long term 10,
Yeah.
20-year visioning work.
Yeah, and there's opportunity there. A world free of mental health, or a world where everyone is mentally healthy is is something
Exactly.
you can work.
Exactly. That's what we want to rally around.
Yeah. Wonderful, and I think that's where a lot of a lot of the spiritual side of the work that's happening in the world in general um, is focusing around is the upliftment of mental health through spiritual well-being, because and there's a lot of I see a lot of good momentum in that space, and we have lots and lots of wonderful teachers in the world who are doing great service in helping people uplift themselves to the next level, become more conscious beings, and raise the level of awareness and be a more fulfilled individual. And it's a process, and somewhere that's probably going to intersect some of the crisis that we're handling today. And I think the 15-year window is, if we meet 15 years down the line, hopefully that part should be not an issue anymore.
One of the books that I read as part of those high school days was a book called The Global Brain by Peter Russell. And it just really talked about that collective consciousness, that collective well-being, and how important that is. And just at a personal level, not the collaborative or anything, but just at a personal level, I really find that that's got to be in the equation somewhere for me, and I just really we need to quit thinking about all these things on islands. It's all interconnected. And one of the things that I do to kind of remind myself of that is I have this brooch. I don't know if you can see it, but it's this mosaic brooch that I wear when I'm doing suicide prevention work. And it really is about all these pieces. The metaphor is just so perfect, both in terms of the future is composed of so many different things to get the vision. But then mental health is as well. There's all these different things that factor into it. And even in the time of adversity, we can make something beautiful out of that. And our best future is in front of us, and that best vision is in front of us. And we just need to keep that in mind going forward.
Yep. Wonderfully said.
My monk manual keeps me going.
Yeah, I'll check out the monk manual for sure. All right. Moving into the last part of our conversation, Lisa, and this is more of a fun, round. I have a few Q&A questions for you.
Okay.
Fun questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Sounds good.
You ready?
Yep.
Can you hear me all right? Okay.
I can.
What's your favorite way to unwind?
Oh, that's a good one.
Did you get that? I'll repeat it.
Gardening. I'm getting into gardening and feeding deer and birds.
Nice. Do you have deer near your house, or you go somewhere?
Yep. Right in the backyard, we throw a little deer corn out there, and we hang out with them for a little bit.
Nice. That's gardening. Yeah, that's amazing. Yes. Great choices. What's your favorite junk food?
Pizza. I'm a Chicago girl. Pizza.
Okay. I should have guessed that. All right. I think you maybe answered this question, but maybe a book that has impacted your worldview.
So there's a couple, the Freetop Capra's The Turning Point, and anything by Bucky Fuller. I am such a fangirl on Bucky Fuller, and also knowing his background of teaching at the Southern Illinois University. I'm just a big believer in his structural change and doing more with less. And Bucky all the way.
All right. I haven't read any of his books. I'll check it out. Bucky Fuller. Okay. Good one. A place to visit once the pandemic is over.
So I am, as a futurist, South America. So I just think that there's, in Africa, I think are two regions in particular that we can look for some interesting trends and opportunities there to kind of leapfrog over some paradigms that maybe are entrenched in other parts of the world. So I'm anxious to kind of look at that a little bit.
Okay.
At a personal level, really just seeing family, just trying to get back to family members that we haven't seen during the pandemic. So that's really high on the gotta do list.
Okay, the last one, which is a favorite question I have for all my guests, is if we made a movie about you, about your life, what genre would you put it in? And who would you hire to act your character?
Probably science fiction,
Okay.
some sort of sci-fi futuristic,
Yeah.
creation of the world. And I have always been a fan of the actress Kate Jackson.
Okay.
And
Kate
I
Jackson.
would love for her to play me. It's a,
All right. Kate Jackson, a script's on its way. Check for
there
your
you
email.
go.
Check for your mail.
There you go.
All right. Hey, thanks. You did well. We got to know a little bit more about you in that. And so, yeah, thanks, Lisa. Appreciate
Thank
you
you.
sharing yourself. And we're coming to end of our conversation.
So
Wish you
now I'll say
all the
thank
best.
you for all you're doing and the cool people you're talking to. So looking forward to visiting on that.
Yeah, thank you.